The story of Hedviga Golik is one that has been featured on hundreds of top 10 lists of the strange and macabre all over the internet for the past 10 years. The details given are usually the same and limited to a few paragraphs. There are so many conflicting accounts that some believe it to be no more than urban legend. I've tried my best to dig a little deeper and make sense of it all. The city of Zagreb is the largest in Croatia and the country's capital. Around 50 years ago, when Croatia was still part of communist Yugoslavia, a woman named Hedviga Golik lived in a small loft apartment at number 77 Medvešćak Street, a 4-storey building in the district of Medvešćak. Miss Golik was well known by her neighbours, but when she was seen for the last time, most sources say the year was 1966, it was assumed that she had simply moved away. After all, she had spoken about moving to Macedonia, so her sudden disappearance didn't come as a shock. The 42-year-old's absence was accepted, and over time eventually forgotten by most. All the while, the door to her apartment remained firmly locked. It appears that since as early as the 1980s, a question had hung over the abandoned apartment. Who truly owned it? The neighbours, some who had been children when Hedviga Golik was last seen, claimed to have been responsible for paying the property tax for the place, even though they believe she had moved away decades ago. Why they would do this is unclear, but there is another claim that says the architect who built and furbished the apartment was the true owner, and had gifted the apartment to Miss Golik in 1961 when she moved to Zagreb from the city of Rijeka in the west of Croatia. The ownership of the property is a grey area. During the Yugoslavian communist era, before Croatia gained independence in 1991, many homes were confiscated and became property of the state. A property restitution law was passed in the early 90s, meaning homes were returned to the owners. But as it was unclear who was the owner, the tenants of the apartment building found themselves in a complicated legal predicament. In 1991, the local housing authority received a request from tenant Mirko Hovatic to break into the apartment to see if there was any signs of life or evidence of ownership. They refused. Hovatic later said, "I honestly don't know why nobody has broken into the apartment. We requested it so many times, but nobody has listened to us." In 1998, a crudely written note in black marker forbidding entry appeared on the still-locked door of Hedviga Golik's old apartment, apparently signed by the census committee for the city of Zagreb. But officials working for the organisation denied any knowledge of it. It roughly translates to the following. Based on the law of inheritance, tenant H. Golik remains without inheritance. Until ownership rights are resolved, tenants cannot use the apartment, and every attempt to enter is a criminal offence. It was later found out that an unnamed tenant wrote the note to deter other tenants from entering and using the apartment. It would take a further 10 years before any action was taken. In 2008, decades after Miss Golik was last seen in the neighbourhood, the long-standing dispute over ownership of the property came to a head, when 3 neighbours took it upon themselves to finally investigate. At 4 p.m. on Monday, May the 12th, 2008, Hedviga Golik's former living space, isolated from the rest of the building by a set of steps and a hallway, was finally forced open. What those people of 21st century Croatia found was a place suspended in time, a time of the Yugoslavian communist era. The 20-square-foot apartment was awash with cobwebs, which covered hundreds of artifacts from a time before some of them were born. It was clear that the place had remained untouched for decades. Tenant Saimi Ungar would go on to tell reporters in the days that followed, "When I entered, I noticed something on the bed of this tiny dark apartment. I ran out and we called the police." Most accounts claim that Miss Golik's partially mummified remains were found sat in front of the television, but the previous quote supports the other version of the story that says she was lying on her bed with a tea-stained cup placed on the bedside table. At least one window in the apartment was said to be open, diminishing any odour, and was the reason given for no one noticing the rotting corpse all those years ago. An autopsy took place on Thursday, May 15, 2008. Pathologist Davor Strinovic said that she had likely died from natural causes, but after so much time it was impossible to say for sure. Of course, there was always the unlikely scenario that the remains were not Miss Golik's, but when her identification papers were found close to her body, and the age of the deceased matched that of Miss Golik's, it was decided that it was her. Jadranka Markic, who was 9 years old at the time of Golik's disappearance, said, "She was a quiet woman who kept herself to herself. She was polite. We all thought that she had just moved out and gone to live with relatives." There are various conflicting versions of events to consider. For example, most reports say that Miss Golik was never reported missing, while another said she was reported missing in the 1970s, and a widespread search was made. The year in which she was last seen is also up for debate. When this story first hit the newspapers, the last sighting of Miss Golik was most commonly given as 1973, meaning her body had remained undisturbed for 35 years. 1966 was the year given by many other news outlets, making it 42 years. 1967 was also given as the year Miss Golik was last seen, allegedly in the company of 2 unidentified men. Forensic experts concluded that she had died around 40 years before her discovery, so any of the given dates could be correct. The tenants were left to argue over who had rights to the property, but following the 2008 discovery, it was found that Hedviga Golik had an estranged sister, whom she had fallen out with years ago. Her name was Rosik Leistner, and is first in line to gain ownership of the property if she is still alive and comes forward to claim it. There is no mention of efforts to find Rosik Leistner. Some say that ultimately the property's value will be shared between the remaining tenants. Others say that if it is not claimed by Miss Golik's sister, it will become property of the state. I was unable to find what became of the property, or even where Miss Golik was laid to rest. I've tried my best to piece together what little information I have about Hedviga Golik's life. The most intriguing information, and arguably the most reliable, has come from Croatian sources, like the Jutarnji List newspaper. I found out that she was a nurse, working at a hospital in Tresnievka, 3.5 miles southwest of her home. Surprisingly, the architect who built the apartment and allegedly gifted it to Miss Golik in 1961 died just a few months before she was discovered. He was her lover, according to Croatian newspapers. It was also mentioned that neighbours, rightly or wrongly, believed that Miss Golik suffered from schizophrenia due to her bad temper and tendency to isolate herself. 85-year-old Hedviga Golik was one of the longest-standing tenants in the building and lived on the ground floor. When she spoke to newspapers in 2008 from her retirement home, it appeared that she was the closest thing Miss Golik had as a friend. She said that when Miss Golik was housebound, she would drop money and a shopping list from her window so that Miss Golik could buy her groceries for her. So at one point at least, it appears that she did have someone who cared for her to a degree. Hedviga Golik also believed that there was a darker side to her friend. According to her, Miss Golik belonged to a religious cult, and admitted that despite others thinking that she had moved away to live with family in Macedonia, she always believed that she had joined the cult. In the aftermath of the 2008 discovery, when the country was made aware of what had happened, the feuding tenants were criticised for their lack of concern and not checking the apartment sooner. They replied by saying that after so many years they had no reason to think anything was amiss, and besides, the law stated that they could not enter the property. There had been many changes since Hedviga Golik's death. Governments came and went, and war broke out and ended. The country she died in no longer existed by the time she was found. Maybe the people who cared about her the most simply passed on too.